After losing his job, his home, and almost every reason to keep going, a retired Navy SEAL drove into the frozen mountains of Montana with only his loyal German Shepherd beside him. He thought his grandfather had left him nothing but an old cabin buried in snow. But when the dog began scratching at the floor beside the stove, the soldier realized something had been hidden there for years. Beneath the boards was a secret his grandfather protected until the right moment, a secret powerful enough to bring danger to his door and hope back to his broken life. If you believe God can guide us through loyalty, courage, and hidden miracles, keep watching, subscribe, and follow this story until the end. The rain slid down the tall glass windows of downtown Seattle, streaking the gray skyline and making the city feel smaller, wetter, almost claustrophobic. The kind of persistent drizzle that seeps into bones and thoughts alike, tapping against rooftops and collecting in puddles on slick sidewalks. Inside a quiet office on First Avenue, Liam Harper sat at his desk, the fluorescent lights above flickering slightly, reflecting in his steel blue eyes that had seen too much for a man of 39, eyes framed by cropped ash-brown hair flecked with gray, a short, disciplined beard, and a faint scar trailing along his left wrist from years of Navy SEAL training and missions. He had broad shoulders, a compact athletic build, the kind of body shaped by decades of deliberate movement, discipline, and endurance. The email had arrived at 10:17, and even before reading, Liam knew its content because he had seen this language before in sterile office communications. Vague subject line, HR signature, restructuring, transition, appreciation, a euphemistic way of telling someone their decades of service no longer mattered. Beneath the desk, Ranger, his 7-year-old German Shepherd, sable working line, amber eyes sharp and alert, thick fur rippling with subtle tension, lay quietly, chest rising and falling with measured calm, ears flicking occasionally, sensing the undercurrents in the room that Liam could already feel pressing against him. Ranger's head nudged against Liam's boot, gentle but insistent, a silent reminder that while the world could betray, some loyalty remained unshakable. The rain intensified, blurring the outlines of the office buildings and the piles of mist-shrouded pine logs in the distance. And Liam's mind drifted to the decades he had spent waking before dawn, showing up when others slept, fixing problems no one else wanted to touch, carrying the invisible weight of responsibility and vigilance. He rubbed the scar on his wrist, feeling the faint throb beneath the skin. Memories of missions in Afghanistan flashing briefly, dust and rotors, and the adrenaline of life-or-death decisions, juxtaposed against the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the distant tap of water running off the roof. By 11:04, he was sitting across from a young manager, Jackson Miller, 32, tall, wiry, constantly adjusting his tie, eyes darting nervously, hands fidgeting as though the situation itself was too heavy for someone untested by real danger. Liam's gaze swept over him, almost pitying the boy, before the instinct of a SEAL reminded him that empathy could not alter reality. "We appreciate everything you've done here," Jackson said, voice tentative, words thin and drifting like smoke in the office air. Liam nodded, letting them wash over him without attachment. All that remained tangible from 20 years of dedication was the cardboard box on his lap, framed photos, a coffee mug, a few notebooks, symbols of a life condensed into items that barely fit into a pickup bed. The office smelled faintly of paper, cleaning solution, and rain seeping through the seams of old windows, a scent Liam associated with endings rather than beginnings. Outside, the L-shaped parking lot shimmered with rain, nearly empty, puddles reflecting the dull silver sky, while Liam walked slowly toward his Ford F-150 parked at the far end. Ranger followed, paws silent on wet asphalt, muscles taut but composed, eyes never leaving Liam. The city passed quietly in the rearview mirror as he drove home, streets washed gray, reflections blurred, the windshield wipers tracing a rhythmic pulse that echoed the steady, unyielding heartbeat of a dog trained to anticipate danger and comfort his handler in equal measure. The apartment, 2 small rooms, 1 worn recliner, 1 faded couch, a refrigerator humming louder each month, smelled faintly of coffee and dust, the kind of place a man ends up in when life strips away everything and yet leaves him breathing. 7 years had passed since his wife's death from cancer, and Emily, their daughter, 12, lived nearly 1,000 miles away, their contact limited to infrequent calls and holiday cards. The apartment felt smaller than ever, the walls pressing in, and yet Ranger settled near his feet, offering warmth and unspoken reassurance. He placed the cardboard box on the kitchen table and simply stood, listening to the rain tapping a quiet rhythm against the panes, letting the silence press against the walls, broken only by the soft thud of Ranger's head nudging his hand. The dog, patient, loyal, seemed to understand that the man needed presence more than words, that the weight of loss was too large for explanations. Liam's fingers traced the edge of the box as he recalled fragments of letters and keepsakes his grandfather, Harold Harper, had left behind. Old notes, a map to a cabin at Timber Ridge, Montana, the promise of a place that might still harbor the past and offer some measure of restoration. As night fell early over Seattle, wind stirring the trees and rattling window frames, Liam sat down beside Ranger, letting the dog's warmth and steady breathing anchor him. He allowed himself the quiet observation of the small apartment, memories of a family long gone, and the faint hope sparked by a message from Clara Simmons, 36, veterinarian, medium height, lean, calm, practical, who had been a friend and confidant during previous missions, checking on Ranger and urging Liam to consider a trip to Timber Ridge to face the ghosts of the past and find a path forward. He stared at the phone in silence, rain blurring the world outside, shadows forming shapes in the dim interior, and for a moment allowed himself to envision the drive north, the mountains ahead, the cabin awaiting, and Ranger at his side, eyes bright with unspoken understanding, ears alert, the kind of companion who could carry a man through darkness without asking for anything in return. Liam exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the day, the city, the loss, and the tentative thread of hope offered by a journey back to a place where memory and loyalty intersected. For the first time that day, he felt the faintest spark of determination, the recognition that while a job, a home, or a title could be taken, the bond with Ranger remained inviolate, a constant in a world that had taken so much. He packed a small duffel with essentials, including documents, personal effects, and Ranger's medication, listening to the rain hammer softly against the roof, the apartment settling around him, a quiet sanctuary in a storm-washed city, and knew that tomorrow the road to Montana would begin, carrying both him and the dog toward whatever reconciliation the past could offer, a journey of grief, memory, and perhaps the first step toward reclaiming pieces of a life thought lost. Ranger shifted at his side, low growl of approval, eyes tracking every movement, and Liam allowed himself a brief, tentative smile, the first sign in days that the weight of loss might be lightened, even if only by a steadfast companion and the promise of Timber Ridge. Seattle was still wet before sunrise, the city wrapped in a low marine fog that softened the streetlights and made every parked car look abandoned. And inside the small apartment, Liam Harper moved through the dim rooms with the quiet efficiency of a man who had once packed for missions where forgetting one item could cost more than comfort. He wore his full U.S. Navy working uniform Type 3, long-sleeve blouse and trousers in AOR2 digital woodland. The fabric faded from use but kept with disciplined care, brown combat boots laced tight, a dark field jacket folded across the back of a chair, his broad shoulders and compact athletic frame moving slowly, not because he lacked strength, but because every object he touched carried some memory he had not asked to revisit. On the kitchen table lay what remained of a life reduced to essentials: discharge papers sealed in a weatherproof sleeve, VA documents, a small stack of photographs, Ranger's medication for his hips, a first aid roll, 2 changes of clothes, an old folding knife from his grandfather Harold, and the faded envelope mentioning Timber Ridge, Montana, which seemed heavier than all the rest, though it was only paper. Ranger watched from beside the door, the 7-year-old German Shepherd K9 standing tall despite the gray along his muzzle, sable coat thick and clean, amber eyes intelligent and steady, ears angled forward, body calm in the way only a trained working dog could be calm, not relaxed exactly, but prepared, as if he understood that leaving was not escape and that the road ahead might ask something from both of them. Liam packed the truck without ceremony, carrying each duffel down the wet stairs and setting it into the bed of the Ford beneath a black tarp, while the apartment building behind him creaked awake with old pipes, distant footsteps, and the muted cough of someone starting a car too early. He did not leave a note for anyone because there was almost no one to notify, and the thought landed harder than he expected as he stood by the open driver's door, looking back at the windows of the apartment where he had spent years pretending that survival was the same thing as living. Ranger climbed into the passenger seat without being told, turned once, then settled facing forward, his posture alert, his nose lifting slightly toward the damp morning air. Before pulling away, Liam checked his phone and saw a message from Clara Simmons, the 36-year-old veterinarian who had once treated Ranger after a training injury and somehow remained in Liam's life because she had the stubborn kindness of people who did not leave easily. Clara was medium height, lean from long days on her feet, with practical brown hair usually tied back, hazel eyes that missed very little, and a calm voice shaped by years of handling frightened animals and damaged people with the same careful patience. Her message asked if Ranger had eaten, if his gait had changed, if he was licking the right shoulder again, and Liam frowned because the question was too specific, too observant, and he glanced at Ranger, who pretended not to notice. The highway south of Seattle opened under a sky the color of cold metal, rain thinning into mist as the city disappeared behind them. And for a while, Liam drove without music, letting the windshield wipers mark time across the glass, while Ranger watched the road as though reading something written beyond human sight. Traffic thinned after they crossed into the long stretches of forest and farmland, where wet evergreens leaned close to the highway and low clouds dragged across the hills, and Liam felt the first strange loosening inside his chest. Not peace, not yet, but distance from the office tower, the fluorescent lights, the cardboard words of the layoff. His thoughts drifted toward Afghanistan without asking permission, as they often did when roads became long and silence had too much room to grow. He saw sand pressed flat under armored tires, the white flash of sunlight on metal, the hand signal of a teammate up ahead, the sudden stillness before a blast, and his grip tightened on the wheel until Ranger lifted his head and pressed his muzzle against Liam's elbow. That single touch brought the cab back into focus. Rain on glass, heater humming, Montana still far ahead, the dog beside him breathing warm and steady. Liam swallowed once, loosened his fingers, and said softly, "I'm here," though he was not sure whether he was speaking to Ranger or himself. By afternoon, the rain had become a thin gray veil over eastern Washington, and Liam stopped at a roadside gas station outside Spokane, a lonely place with 2 fuel pumps, a flickering sign, and a store that smelled of burned coffee, rubber mats, and old cigarettes trapped in wood paneling. Behind the counter stood Earl Whitcomb, a man in his late 60s with a round belly, white eyebrows, a faded mariner's cap, and the blunt but harmless manner of someone who had spent most of his life talking to truckers, hunters, and people passing through with faces that said more than their words. Earl noticed Ranger first, because everyone noticed Ranger first, and his expression softened as the German Shepherd stepped down from the truck with controlled grace, scanning the lot before standing close to Liam's left side. "That dog looks like he knows things," Earl said while ringing up coffee and jerky, and Liam gave a small, tired smile, because it was true in a way too deep for casual conversation. Ranger sniffed the air near the edge of the lot and paused, ears twitching toward the service road beyond the station, where a dark pickup sat idling longer than it should have before rolling away into the mist. Liam watched it disappear, told himself it was nothing, and still felt something old and professional wake behind his ribs. That evening, they reached a cheap motel near Coeur d'Alene, where the vacancy sign buzzed red against wet asphalt, and the room smelled faintly of bleach, old carpet, and forced heat. Liam chose a ground-floor unit with a view of the parking lot, out of habit rather than fear, and set Ranger's bowl near the bathroom door before checking the locks, the window latch, the space beneath the bed, every detail measured in silence. Ranger ate slowly, then stood near Liam while he inspected his shoulder, the spot Clara had mentioned. And there it was. Not a wound, not exactly, but a faint patch of irritated skin beneath the thick fur near the harness line, as if Ranger had been rubbing against something or reacting to stress before Liam had noticed. Liam took a photo and sent it to Clara, and within minutes she called, her voice low and careful through the speaker, telling him that Ranger's body often warned before his behavior did, that service dogs absorbed stress in ways people underestimated, that if Ranger became fixated, restless, or unusually protective near Timber Ridge, Liam needed to listen instead of explaining it away. Liam leaned against the motel wall, watching Ranger stare toward the curtained window. And Clara added more quietly that remote cabins carried risks no one liked to name, especially when old family property had been left untouched for years. Sleep came badly, broken into fragments, and sometime after midnight, Liam found himself back inside a dream where the road was not an interstate, but a desert route outside Kandahar, where headlights became convoy beams and motel rain became grit-striking armor, where a young operator named Mason Cole turned in the seat beside him, smiling the way men smiled before they knew the world had already chosen them for loss. Mason had been 28, red-haired, sharp-jawed, funny in tense rooms, the kind of teammate who could make men laugh when fear had dried every mouth. And in Liam's dream, he was alive until the blast took the road away. Liam woke with his heart hammering, one hand already reaching for a weapon that was not there, breath shallow, room dark, heater clicking. And Ranger was instantly beside the bed, front paws planted, head pressed firmly against Liam's chest with trained pressure that demanded attention without panic. Liam held the dog's neck, felt the strong pulse under warm fur, and waited until the motel returned around him piece by piece, the curtain, the lamp, the boots near the door, the road still waiting outside, the living world still intact. Morning came pale and cold, the rain finally giving way to wind as they crossed into Idaho and then pushed east toward Montana, the landscape widening into valleys, dark timber, distant ridges, and a sky that seemed too large for grief to hide beneath. Liam drove with one hand low on the wheel, Ranger beside him watching every passing tree line, and the miles began to feel less like escape and more like a summons, as if Timber Ridge had been waiting not as a refuge, but as a test. He thought of age, not as numbers, but as accumulation. The faces carried forward, the apologies delayed, the rooms emptied by illness. The daughter he had loved badly after losing her mother because grief had made him quiet when she needed him present. Emily was 12 when her mother died, small for her age then, quick-eyed, stubborn, gentle with animals, and guarded with adults, a girl who had learned too young that people could disappear even while still breathing. And now she lived in New York with her aunt, answering his calls with politeness that hurt worse than anger. Ranger shifted, and Liam looked at him, seeing gray around the muzzle, stiffness in the hips, loyalty still burning bright behind tired amber eyes. And he understood that the dog was aging too, that even loyalty had a body, and that love did not become less urgent just because it had been reliable for years. By late afternoon, snow appeared in patches along the roadside, first like torn cloth caught in the grass, then thicker beneath the pines as the road climbed toward western Montana and the weather changed with the mountains. Clara called again just as the signal began to weaken, reminding Liam to keep Ranger warm, to watch the shoulder, to avoid letting him overwork if they reached the cabin after dark, and beneath her professional tone, Liam heard something personal, a worry she tried to hide because she knew he disliked being handled. He promised he would be careful, though both of them knew careful had never meant safe. When the call dropped, the cab filled with the hum of tires and the low breath of the dog beside him, and Liam let his eyes follow the long highway, bending toward a horizon lined with black timber. He did not yet see Timber Ridge, and he did not yet know what waited there, but he felt the pull of it now, stronger than fear, older than grief, a place tied to his grandfather, to memory, to the possibility that losing the ground beneath him in Seattle had not been the end, but the beginning of a road he had avoided for too long. As dusk settled over the mountains, Liam stopped at a turnout overlooking a wide valley washed in blue shadow, the last light touching the snow on distant peaks, and he stepped out into air so cold it cleared the fog from his thoughts. Ranger climbed down more slowly than he once would have, but he stood beside Liam with dignity, his sable coat moving in the wind, eyes fixed toward the north as if listening to something no human ear could catch. Liam placed one hand on the dog's back and said nothing for a long moment, because words felt unnecessary against the size of the landscape and the weight of everything that had brought them here. Behind them lay Seattle, a lost job, an empty apartment, a life shrinking inward. Ahead lay Timber Ridge, Harold's cabin, and whatever old truth had been waiting there beneath years of silence. Liam finally opened the truck door, waited for Ranger to climb in, and turned the engine back toward the mountain road, carrying only what he could not afford to lose: his papers, his memories, his grief, and the German shepherd who had never once left his side. The highway narrowed as Liam Harper drove deeper into the Bitterroot Mountains, snow beginning to drift across the hood of his Ford F-150. A relentless gray veil that muted the trees and flattened the landscape, the tires crunching against the freshly frozen salt mixture laid across the curves, and Ranger, his 7-year-old German Shepherd K9, sable coat, thick and damp with snow, amber eyes tracking the tree line with a vigilance that had become second nature, head low at first, then lifting to scan every movement, alert to the faintest sound, sat perfectly in the passenger seat, muscles coiled yet controlled, chest rising with steady breaths as if he understood that the mountain roads themselves carried a warning embedded in every curve. Liam adjusted the wheel, feeling the subtle sway of the truck, the pull of gravity against the steep inclines, and thought of his grandfather Harold, imagining the man's rough hands guiding him along these same slopes decades earlier. Harold's deep voice low and steady, instructing a 9-year-old Liam on how to watch the sky for storm clouds, read animal tracks in the snow, measure the wind before attempting a crossing. Lessons that had cemented a cautious patience inside Liam that now blended with every SEAL-trained instinct he had honed over years of service, where every step, every movement, and every pause carried meaning. The cabin emerged finally, half hidden among dark pines, its steep roof thick with snow, smoke curling lazily from the stone chimney into a sky the color of slate. And though it had been 15 years since Liam had last seen it, the structure held itself against time with the quiet dignity of someone who had been maintained, its wooden walls bearing the muted patina of decades, yet showing subtle signs that someone had recently cleared the roof and stacked fresh firewood along the side, a faint curl of warmth drifting toward the eaves, the lapping scent of pine smoke carried on the wind, and Ranger immediately rose, tail low but rigid, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as he stepped carefully onto the snow-packed path, claws clicking against hardened powder, body tense yet deliberate. And Liam noted how even after years, Ranger's instincts outpaced his own, the dog's gaze following each shadow cast by the cabin and the surrounding firs, signaling that caution was required even in the silence of snow. Stepping from the truck, Liam's boots sank into the powdery snow, damp through the soles, the cold biting the gaps of his gloves, and he scanned the clearing, noting footprints of unknown size and recency. One set approaching the porch, another curving around the cabin's rear. impressions sharp and deep, suggesting a large man, or perhaps two, had passed not long before. He crouched slightly, Ranger circling at his side, nose to the ground, nostrils quivering as if reading a narrative invisible to human eyes. And Liam realized immediately that the cabin had not been entirely abandoned, that someone had been here, and that whatever his grandfather had left behind might already have drawn attention. He approached the front porch, noting the subtle repairs along the threshold, nails fresh and wood not worn smooth by decades of snow, and the faint smell of coffee lingering not like a memory, but like a signal, as though someone had been inside recently, keeping the hearth alive. Ranger stopped at the top of the steps, low growl vibrating through his chest, ears flattened in a warning stance, a clear indicator that the space was occupied or surveilled. Liam's eyes followed the dog's focus, noting shadows shifting across the cabin windows, despite the thick snow obscuring clarity, the air still except for the occasional groan of ice-laden branches above. He checked the rifle secured beneath the tarp in the truck bed, verifying the strap, the chamber, the safety, and then leaned down, feeling Ranger's head press against his leg, drawing him into the immediacy of the moment, grounding him as instincts sharpened and his mind cataloged the unknown variables: tracks, smell, timing, potential threat. A faint movement at a side window drew Liam's attention. A dark shape, indistinct, shifting just enough to suggest a human presence. He froze, letting Ranger step slightly forward, eyes locked on the window, tail still, muscles tight, signaling readiness and expectation without sound. Liam exhaled slowly, the chill of the wind mixing with adrenaline as he traced the perimeter, noting every branch that might conceal a person, every glint of metal, the faintest trace of footprints disappearing into drifts. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind, a memory of careful instruction. Patience first, sight second, movement last. A lesson learned in boyhood and honed through service, now guiding him silently alongside Ranger's unwavering judgment. Stepping carefully, Liam reached the porch and gently pushed open the door, the hinge creaking softly under fresh lubrication, the warmth of the cabin reaching out like an embrace. Smoke swirled from the stove, the scent of burning pine mingling with the faint aroma of old coffee and oiled wood. Inside, a man stood by the hearth, broad-shouldered, early 70s. Gray beard, blue flannel rolled at the sleeves, hands resting openly on the table. And though the man was a stranger, his calm presence and steady gaze carried authority and a lack of threat, each movement deliberate, measured, and unhurried. And Liam realized immediately that he had encountered someone who understood both the weight of trust and the presence of the dog. "Good dog," the man said, voice low and steady, acknowledging Ranger's inspection without command or coaxing. Ranger's body relaxed slightly, still attentive, eyes tracking the man, but now measured by acceptance rather than suspicion. Liam stepped inside, careful, noting the interior. A table, chairs, blankets folded over a backrest, a cast-iron stove glowing orange near the far wall. Everything showing signs of care despite years of assumed abandonment. The man inclined his head slightly, eyes softening as he recognized Liam's stance, the tension that comes from years of training, loss, and alertness. "You going to stand out there all night?" he asked, a faint humor under the surface. Liam nodded subtly, then exhaled, letting the awareness of being observed, but not judged, ease slightly through his chest. The man introduced himself as Caleb Turner, 42, tall, broad-shouldered, hair graying at the temples, rugged but approachable, a former logging colleague of Harold Harper, used to the cold and isolated terrain of the region, steady hands and voice that carried the authority of experience, someone who had spent decades reading timber, men, and machinery with equal care. Liam noted the faint familiarity in his posture and the way he observed the cabin as if measuring history itself. And yet his focus remained on Ranger, the dog remaining the silent sentinel between them, amber eyes fixed, alert to every subtle cue. Caleb explained, slowly, without unnecessary elaboration, that he had maintained the cabin at Harold's request, checking the stove and firewood multiple times a month, ensuring that the space remained ready for the eventual return of Harold's grandson. And Liam felt the weight of continuity, the careful orchestration of trust that had lasted 15 years, a testament to loyalty, both human and canine. Liam moved through the cabin, noting subtle repairs, the neat stacking of wood, the cleanliness of the windows despite the storm outside, and yet the footprints and the faint signs of fresh movement reminded him that this was not a space abandoned, but watched, maintained for reasons that perhaps went beyond him. Ranger padded silently beside him, muscles relaxed but ready, sniffing, alert, signaling that even the most mundane detail might contain a message. And Liam followed, understanding that the mountains had their own vigilance, that the cabin was now both a refuge and a point of tension, that the past and present converged here in a landscape as isolated as it was alive. And he allowed himself a measured breath, appreciating the warmth of the cabin, the quiet loyalty of the dog, and the knowledge that the journey, though dangerous, had begun in earnest. The morning air at Timber Ridge carried a sharp metallic scent mixed with snow and pine, the wind bending branches low and scattering fresh powder across the small clearing. And Liam Harper stepped carefully onto the porch, his breath visible in the cold, his eyes scanning every shadow as Ranger, alert and poised, padded silently at his side, amber eyes flicking constantly, ears angled forward, every muscle taut but controlled, his sable coat absorbing the snowfall without losing warmth, the dog a living gauge of instinctive caution that Liam had long learned to trust more than any device or human advice. Inside, the cabin smelled of burning pine, old coffee, and oiled wood, the cast-iron stove sending a steady warmth into the room, the furniture aligned exactly as Caleb Turner had described, blankets folded meticulously, chairs positioned as if someone had just risen, and the dim light from a single window illuminating the subtle repairs that hinted at careful attention over the last several months. Liam moved toward the back of the main room, where a faint draft and the echo of Ranger's restless pawing drew his attention to a section of floorboards near the stove, where the grain of the wood seemed slightly irregular, worn smooth in places, as if something beneath had been nudged or shifted repeatedly. He crouched, sliding one hand across the seam, feeling the subtle hollow beneath, and Ranger pressed close, low growl rumbling through his chest, ears pressed back, signaling insistence without alarm. Liam's mind flicked to the envelope from his grandfather, the small iron key tucked inside, and the map hand-drawn decades ago, ink faded but still clear, showing the trail through the foothills to a precise location marked with careful strokes. A place meant to remain hidden until discovered by someone who understood the care required to survive both terrain and the secrets it held. He knelt further, pressing the key gently into the seam, the cold metal biting through his glove, turning it slowly until a faint click released the mechanism. A soft shift of wood against wood, and the panel lifted slightly, enough to reveal the darkness beneath. A narrow staircase descending into shadow, air cool and slightly damp but not stale, suggesting a space maintained in some fashion, ventilated and protected from the elements. Ranger's head lifted, nose twitching as he sniffed the descending steps, his body coiled, muscles ready, signaling both readiness and curiosity. And Liam felt the familiar tension of anticipation settle over him, each breath measured, each heartbeat synchronized to the dog's alert stance, a rhythm that had carried him through long deployments and firefights where every movement and pause held consequence. As Liam carefully lowered himself onto the first step, his flashlight cutting a pale cone of light into the darkness. His phone buzzed quietly. Clara Simmons, still 20 miles behind on the road, had managed to catch a signal long enough to alert him. There had been intermittent GPS interference in the area, unusual blips on the frequencies they had monitored, suggesting someone, or something, was tracking movements in the vicinity. Clara's voice carried over the speaker, calm but insistent, reminding Liam to move cautiously, that Timber Ridge, while isolated, could no longer be considered empty, that the cabin, its location, and even the map could have drawn attention from parties unknown. Liam acknowledged her warnings without answering, slipping the phone back into his pocket, eyes returning to the narrow stairwell and Ranger shifting slightly, tail low, a steadying weight at his side. The descent revealed a small landing, rough stone walls reinforced with timber beams. Dust settled lightly on surfaces, yet not enough to suggest abandonment. Rows of workbenches and shelving aligned with precision, tools hung in perfect order, and the air carried the faint tang of metal, leather, and oil, mingled with the pine smoke drifting down from the main room. Liam's pulse quickened as he traced each line of craftsmanship with his eyes, seeing not only objects, but decades of careful work preserved beneath the floor, a testament to his grandfather's meticulous care and foresight. The first cabinet revealed shelves of handcrafted leather holsters, saddles, spurs, and molds, each piece resting in designated spaces, flawless yet functional. The kind of work that could support a small enterprise or a hobbyist's obsession. Liam noted the subtle differences in wear and finish, the consistency of the layout suggesting that the space had been maintained with purpose, and Ranger stepped forward, low muzzle brushing against Liam's leg, pressing insistently toward a set of crates stacked at the far wall. Liam moved beside him, following the dog's instinct, and discovered dozens of folders neatly labeled, business records, invoices, contracts, and correspondences, with clients scattered across Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and Colorado. Names familiar only to a few, the numbers small yet steady, evidence that his grandfather had quietly maintained a successful enterprise alongside his personal ventures. Liam traced each envelope and folder with gloved fingers, feeling the presence of someone who had meticulously planned not just the craft, but its legacy, and the thought of Derek Walker, his estranged cousin, seeking these documents years ago, reminded him of the fragile intersection of trust, bloodlines, and greed. Ranger growled softly, a low vibration signaling another point of focus, and Liam's attention shifted to a section of flooring slightly different in texture, a subtle warp in the boards, just enough to suggest a hidden compartment. He knelt again, pressing along the seams, careful not to disturb the alignment, and the small brass key he had recovered from a drawer the previous night slid perfectly into a barely noticeable lock, turning smoothly with a faint click. The panel moved slightly, revealing a narrow steel safe embedded into the stone wall behind. The air cool and metallic, dust disturbed minimally, a silent indication of recent care or at least inspection. Liam straightened, letting Ranger sniff the opening, the dog's amber eyes scanning for danger as if he could read the intentions of anyone who might have known about this chamber. Liam reached inside and opened the safe, revealing only 3 items: a thick folder of property deeds, a sealed envelope, and a leather-bound ledger, all preserved with care, all legal, all meticulously organized, confirming that the space beneath the floor was intended for preservation and secure concealment, nothing extravagant, yet priceless in context. The folders contained decades of transactions, records of craftsmanship, trust documents, and licensing agreements meticulously documented, leading Liam to understand that Harold had quietly built a legacy meant for him, carefully safeguarded from outsiders. The envelope bore his name in bold, deliberate handwriting, and inside, a letter explained in concise yet profound terms that everything, the cabin, the workshops, the property, and the enterprise, had been prepared for him. That life had indeed been harder than it should have, but he had survived, and that survival was recognized. Liam held the letter, eyes tracing each line, Ranger sitting close, head low but attentive, the dog's presence an unspoken reassurance, grounding him amidst the revelations, while Clara's earlier warning echoed in his mind, a reminder that even in isolation, vigilance was essential, and that Timber Ridge, though a sanctuary, carried both history and risk intertwined. The cabin beneath Timber Ridge was no longer a simple refuge. It was a carefully curated repository of family, legacy, and secrets, waiting for someone who could understand their value, and Liam felt the weight of responsibility settle upon him, tempered by the steady, patient presence of Ranger, the German shepherd who had never left his side. The night settled over Timber Ridge with a weight that felt almost physical, the snow drifting steadily from darkened skies, layering the ground in soft white and masking the faintest sounds. And inside the cabin, Liam Harper moved deliberately along the polished wooden floor, Ranger at his side, amber eyes scanning shadows, tail low but muscles coiled, every step measured, the dog's fur dusted with snow from the porch earlier, muzzle slightly damp, paws silent but alert, the cadence of their movement in harmony with the rhythmic hiss of the stove, the faint creak of timber settling under cold, dense air. Liam's hands traced the surfaces of the leather-bound ledger he had examined earlier, absorbing every detail of contracts, property deeds, and licensing records, each paper a fragment of a life carefully curated by his grandfather, each signature proof that the cabin was more than shelter. It was a vault of knowledge and protection, a place designed to outlast curiosity, greed, and time itself. And yet the footprints discovered outside earlier in the snow had not vanished from Liam's memory. They pressed against his mind like a shadow of caution that demanded constant attention. Ranger stiffened, nostrils flaring, ears pivoting toward the northern wall, low growl building in his chest, and Liam's eyes followed the dog's focus toward a darkened window, barely visible through the drift of snow, where a faint silhouette moved in hesitant, calculated steps. Liam's pulse tightened, muscles remembering the precise discipline honed over decades in the Navy SEALs. Every lesson about observation, patience, and the careful reading of enemy movement, replaying like a silent soundtrack. He adjusted his weight, moving so that the stove and furniture blocked the light from the open doorway behind him, the glow casting shadows that masked his exact position, while Ranger's stance, disciplined and instinctive, served as both warning and guide. Liam's mind cataloged the variables: 2 possible intruders, timing unknown, weapons unobserved, the snow outside masking sound, their intent likely aligned with the secret hidden beneath the cabin floor, the documents, the handcrafted items preserved in meticulous order, all signaling that the risks had evolved from the theoretical to the immediate. From the satellite view of the property, Clara Simmons had noticed earlier anomalies on GPS readings, faint signals she could not fully identify, and now her voice came through Liam's phone speaker, calm but urgent. "Liam, I'm monitoring from here. The trackers show movement along the service road to the north. Keep Ranger close. Do not engage unless you are certain. I've arranged a med kit at the edge of the valley, and emergency services are aware if extraction becomes necessary." Her voice, steady and measured, reminded him that despite isolation, he was not entirely alone, and that the bond between Liam and Ranger, while extraordinary, required support and coordination, a reminder that expertise alone never replaced preparation. Liam replied softly, "Understood," and secured the phone, letting Ranger's amber gaze and low growl dictate their next movements. The intruders approached cautiously, the faint crunch of snow under heavy boots audible now and again, the echo amplified by the stillness of the trees, the drifted whiteness reflecting whatever faint moonlight filtered through the cloud cover. Liam crouched low near the far wall, the stove between him and the expected point of entry, eyes locked on the shadowed window, heart steady despite the surge of adrenaline, training taking over in the way it had countless times in Afghanistan, in training exercises, and in moments where the cost of miscalculation was irrevocable. Ranger shifted slightly, nose low, following the scent of the intruders, body tense but precise, indicating the trajectory of movement and offering silent assessment. The first figure appeared at the porch, dark-clad, hood obscuring the face, hands moving to manipulate the latch. Liam's mind processed. Entry, potential weapon, probable motive aligned with the grandfather's hidden compartment, timing optimal for surprise. He remained perfectly still, breathing shallow, every muscle prepared for motion that would only be necessary when miscalculation threatened to harm Ranger or himself. A sudden snap of a branch alerted both man and dog simultaneously. Ranger lunged first, padded paws hitting the floor, a single growl cutting through the ambient sound of wind and creaking timber, the intruder stepping back instinctively as Liam followed, shifting along the shadowed edge, moving to manipulate light and perception, guiding the intruder away from the door, each motion deliberate, a combination of stealth and tactical signaling learned over years of missions where discretion and misdirection preserved lives. The second figure appeared behind the first, stepping onto the porch, carrying a crowbar. Body language hurried but careful, intent clear, and Ranger reacted instantly, barreling toward the first man, contact sending him stumbling back onto the snow while the second froze, calculating indecisive. Liam, using the structure of the cabin, the shadows, the furniture, guided the intruder along a path that maximized cover for him and Ranger, minimized advantage for the trespassers, while simultaneously considering escape routes, alternative exits, and the physical limitations of each intruder in the snow-covered porch. A sharp cry split the night as Ranger took a glancing blow to the side, yelp brief but enough to alert Liam. The dog collapsed momentarily, weight against Liam's knee, pulse strong but uneven, breathing present but labored. Liam knelt, hands steady despite the tension, quickly assessing Ranger's shoulder and side, finding only superficial damage, bleeding but non-lethal, a grazing injury, and he whispered, "Easy, buddy, easy," voice low and steady as he applied pressure, improvised bandaging with a scarf from his jacket, maintaining calm to keep Ranger focused and preventing shock. Ranger's amber eyes met Liam's briefly, still alert, still protective, signaling that the dog's purpose, guardian, partner, friend, remained unshaken despite pain. The intruders, now aware that the cabin and its occupant were prepared, the dog alert and the man unseen but calculating, hesitated, voices low and urgent, deciding whether the risk outweighed the reward. Liam's plan unfolded in real time, drawing them along false perceptions, shadows and light guiding their steps, while Ranger remained the constant, marking every decision with growl, stance, and movement, manipulating perception without loss of control, leading the intruders to a clearing beyond the cabin where snow and drift would expose their presence to night observation, an invisible trap that relied on anticipation rather than brute force. Minutes stretched in tense coordination until, with a subtle signal from Ranger and careful positioning from Liam, the intruders abandoned the cabin, retreating into the darkness, shouting briefly, obeying commands from someone beyond sight, disappearing into the snow-covered forest. Liam exhaled slowly, rising carefully, Ranger moving immediately to his side, tail low, posture alert but relieved. Inside, the cabin remained intact, the stove glowing, the papers and crafted items untouched, the hidden compartment and the ledger safe from any interference, and Liam allowed himself a single, measured breath of relief, knowing that his grandfather's preparations, combined with Ranger's instinct and his own training, had protected what needed to remain secure. Clara called almost immediately after the intruders were gone, voice filled with restrained concern, asking for status, readying emergency response, but hearing Ranger's breathing steady and Liam's calm voice, she allowed herself a brief sigh of relief. Liam updated her succinctly, scanning the perimeter once more, eyes never leaving the shadows where movement had suggested danger. The snow continued falling outside, the wind rising, branches scraping against the cabin roof, and Liam looked down at Ranger, brushing the fur from the small cut, noting how amber eyes met his without question, trust unbroken despite the encounter, and understood fully that the dog had not only saved them in that moment, but reinforced the lesson of loyalty, vigilance, and instinct he had relied upon through decades of missions and loss. Night deepened, snow covering tracks, masking recent movement, the cabin once again a sanctuary, though now with a sharper edge of awareness. Liam arranged Ranger's bed near the stove, checked the hidden compartment one last time, confirming all contents untouched, secure, and preserved. Then allowed himself to sit, back straight, hands resting on knees, listening to the quiet crackle of the fire and the subtle rise and fall of Ranger's breathing. The legacy of Harold Harper remained intact, carefully protected at the moment it was most vulnerable, and Liam's mind allowed itself the faintest acknowledgement of gratitude. Not to the cabin, not to the snow, but to the dog at his side, the companion who had stepped into danger without hesitation, whose instincts had ensured that the past, present, and future remained safeguarded in a single night. Spring came slowly to Timber Ridge, not as a sudden mercy, but as a quiet agreement between snow, stone, and sunlight, the kind of change that first appeared in thin threads of water running beneath the ice near the creek, then in the softer color of the sky above the black pines, then in the way morning light entered the cabin through the repaired windows and laid itself across the floorboards where danger had once gathered. Liam Harper stood in the main room before sunrise, still built with the broad shoulders and compact strength of a Navy SEAL. Steel blue eyes calm but watchful, short ash-brown hair carrying more gray than he remembered seeing in Seattle. His full U.S. Navy working uniform. Type 3, clean but worn, long-sleeve blouse and trousers in AOR2 digital woodland, brown combat boots planted on the old wooden floor, and beside the stove lay Ranger, the 7-year-old sable German Shepherd, K9, whose amber eyes still missed nothing, even with a healing bandage along his ribs and slower movement in his hips. The cabin was no longer just a place Liam had arrived at after losing the ground beneath him. It had become a living thing again, warm in the mornings, smelling of pine smoke, coffee, leather oil, old tools, and the faint, clean scent of snow melting outside. Liam began restoring the workshop beneath the floor, one section at a time, not rushing, not forcing the past to become useful too quickly, but cleaning each bench, sharpening each tool, labeling each cabinet, and opening Harold Harper's hidden craft room to light for the first time in years. Caleb Turner helped most mornings, arriving before the sun rose fully over the ridge, tall, weathered, gray at the beard and temples, broad-handed and practical, the kind of man who spoke little because he believed work said more than conversation ever could, and though he pretended the old cabin was only a responsibility he had inherited from Harold, Liam could see the quiet pride in the way Caleb ran his fingers over repaired wood, checked the hinges, stacked firewood, and inspected the stove. Clara Simmons came twice a week once the mountain roads cleared, lean and steady with her brown hair tied back, hazel eyes sharp beneath a wool cap, veterinarian's bag in one hand and a thermos in the other, treating Ranger's wounds with careful patience while quietly checking on Liam as well, because Clara understood that men like him often healed the dog first and ignored the man completely. The handcrafted saddles, knife handles, leather holsters, and old design patterns Harold had left behind slowly returned to order, and Liam began rebuilding them not as a business at first, but as a ritual, a way of touching something solid that did not disappear when life became hard. He worked in long, quiet stretches, Ranger resting near the bottom of the stairs, always positioned where he could see both the hidden workshop and the cabin above, guarding even while recovering, and Liam often found himself speaking to the dog as if Ranger were another craftsman in the room. "You see that, buddy?" he would murmur while cleaning a silver-inlaid spur or tracing the curve of an unfinished saddle tree. And Ranger would lift one ear, amber eyes patient, as though he had heard enough human grief to know that ordinary conversation was sometimes the first sign of a man returning to himself. Clara noticed it before Liam did, the way his hands stopped shaking when he worked, the way his voice became steadier around the dog, the way he began sleeping longer than 2 hours at a time when Ranger lay beside the bed. Emily Harper arrived on a clear afternoon 3 weeks after the last snowstorm, driving a small blue SUV up the mountain road with both hands tight on the wheel, her face pale from the long climb and the uncertainty of coming back into her father's life after years of careful distance. She was 12 years old, slender and slightly tall for her age, with her mother's soft brown eyes and Liam's guarded silence. Dark blonde hair pulled into a messy braid beneath a knitted hat, and the cautious way of speaking that belonged to a child who had learned early that illness could take one parent, and grief could carry the other far away without ever closing a door. When she stepped out of the car, she stood in the clearing for several seconds, looking at the cabin, the porch, the smoke from the chimney, and then at Liam standing near the steps, and neither of them moved at first, because both understood that love had survived between them but had not known how to speak for a long time. Ranger solved what humans could not. The German Shepherd rose slowly, favoring his side but refusing help, and walked toward Emily with his tail moving in a slow, deliberate rhythm, not the wild greeting of a young dog, but the solemn welcome of a guardian who recognized family. Emily dropped to her knees in the snow-soft mud, arms opening before she seemed to decide, and Ranger pressed his head against her chest as if he had been waiting for her as long as the cabin had been waiting for Liam. She held him tightly, burying her face in the thick sable fur, and Liam saw her shoulders tremble once, then again, not from fear, but from the release of something she had carried too long for a girl her age. Later, inside the cabin, she saw the bandage beneath Ranger's coat and listened as Liam, with no drama and no heroics, told her how the dog had warned him, protected him, and stayed beside him through the worst parts of the journey. Emily looked at Ranger differently after that, not just as a dog, not even only as a K9, but as the loyal witness to her father's pain, the companion who had stood in the spaces where Liam had failed to reach for people, and that realization softened something between father and daughter more than any apology could have done alone. The first real conversation came that night beside the stove, while Clara checked Ranger's breathing, and Caleb quietly repaired a loose chair leg near the table, pretending not to listen. Emily asked about her mother, about Seattle, about why Liam had stopped calling as often after the funeral, and Liam answered without defending himself, his voice low, steady, and rough at the edges, admitting that he had confused silence with strength, that he had believed distance might protect her from seeing him broken, and that he had been wrong. Emily did not forgive everything at once, because real healing did not move like a switch being turned on, but she stayed at the table, asked another question, then another, and when Ranger rested his head across both their feet, neither of them moved away. The cabin held that moment gently, the windows glowing against the dark woods, the stove breathing heat into the room, Caleb's tools clicking softly, Clara's quiet presence making the place feel less like a lonely refuge and more like the beginning of a small, steady community. By early summer, Timber Ridge had become something Liam had never planned and somehow desperately needed. A refuge for veterans who arrived with old injuries, quiet eyes, and dogs that moved with the disciplined patience of animals who had carried too many human storms. Clara helped set up a small treatment corner for retired K9s, keeping supplies stacked neatly beside the old cabinet. Caleb repaired the bunkhouse and acted as if every newcomer annoyed him, though he was always the first to make coffee and the last to leave the porch light on. Emily spent part of her school break there, slowly learning the names of tools, trees, and old scars, discovering that her father was not only the man who had disappeared into grief, but also a man who could teach, build, listen, and begin again. Liam reopened Harold's workshop with care, selling a few restored pieces, displaying the old records, and letting visitors see how one man's hidden craftsmanship had become another man's second chance. Ranger remained at the center of it all, older, slower, gray around the muzzle, but still the first to hear a truck on the lower road, the first to rise when a veteran woke from a nightmare, the first to rest beside someone who did not yet know how to ask for help. Liam watched him often from the porch in the evenings, one hand around a coffee mug, the mountains turning gold beyond the pines, and understood with a clarity that no letter, document, or inheritance could have given him that Ranger had saved his life long before Timber Ridge, not only by warning him of danger, not only by standing between him and intruders, but by refusing to let loneliness become the final shape of his life. The dog had kept him connected to the present, to breath, to movement, to responsibility, and eventually to family. One evening, Emily sat beside Liam with Ranger stretched across the porch boards between them, Clara laughing softly inside the cabin while Caleb argued with the coffee pot, and Liam felt the quiet miracle of ordinary sound fill the clearing. When winter finally released the last of its hold and the valley turned green beneath the high white peaks, Timber Ridge no longer looked abandoned, and Liam no longer looked like a man waiting for life to take the next piece of him. The cabin stood warm and repaired, the workshop alive with careful work, the bunkhouse ready for men, women, and dogs who needed somewhere to breathe. And on the mantel above the stove sat Harold's old map, the iron key, and a photograph Emily had taken. Liam standing on the porch in his Navy uniform. Caleb beside him with one hand on a railing he had rebuilt. Clara kneeling beside Ranger with a smile she tried to hide. Emily leaning against her father's side, and Ranger in front of them all, head lifted, amber eyes calm, as if watching the future arrive. Liam looked at that photograph often and understood that he had come to Timber Ridge believing he had reached the end of everything. But instead, he had found the beginning Harold had protected, the family he almost lost, and the loyal dog who had led him home. At the end of Liam and Ranger's journey, we see that God's miracles sometimes come quietly, through loyalty, love, and patience. A dog who never leaves your side, a cabin waiting in the mountains, or a family reaching back to you. These are ways God guides us home. In life, when we feel lost, remember that as long as God gives us breath, faith, and one step forward, our story is not over. If this story touched you, share it, comment what it meant to you, and type Amen if you believe God restores hope and protects those He loves. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories of faith, courage, and second chances. May God bless you and those you love. Amen.